Okay, good afternoon. Ambassador CKR, other distinguished ambassadors, head of the Chinese community, Chua Tianpo, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Martin Reengagement. I think Dr. Reengagement is one of the rare polymaths in this world who has moved seamlessly between the world of academia, policy thinking, and investment banking or business. Right now, actually, he is doing all three simultaneously rather than serially. He's the professor of international economics at the Catholic University of Buenos Aires. He's also chairman of Fundación Capital, which I think is a kind of economic policy think tank.
That's right.
And he's also a partner in MR Financial Services, which I take it to be a kind of boutique investment bank.
Exactly.
So as you can see, he keeps pretty busy. I think you can see from his CV, in the last, until not so long ago, he was in government for more than 12 years, about 12 years, serving his country with great intelligence and integrity, initially as a trade representative, and subsequently as the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina. In the latter capacity, I think he was on the job during the global financial crisis and played a leading role in steering the country out of what was a very severe situation. I think subsequently, I will not get into details, it is in his book. He had, shall we say, some differences of views with the powers that be, where he stuck to his principles. And I think fought all the way, I think won, but nevertheless resigned from the job. I think this afternoon he's going to talk for about half an hour, 20 minutes or half an hour. And although the talk is about policy challenges in Latin America, which he will touch on briefly, the bulk of the speech will be on Argentina, because I think at the request of our ambassador, since most of us here know quite a bit about some major countries in Latin America, notably Brazil in more recent years. But Argentina, because of various reasons, isn't that well known. So it'll be quite interesting to hear his perspective. But we're leaving a lot of room for Q&A, because we're keeping it short. So feel free to ask any questions on Latin America that you want to, and I think he'll be happy to oblige. Before I end, I think most of you are aware of the February issue of the Economies magazine, where there was a special section on Argentina, where I think its headline is 100 years of decline. But if you read the article carefully, Argentina was one of the fastest growing economies in the world for about nearly 50 years, up to the eve of the First World War, whose 100th anniversary we are celebrating this year. And Argentina was, at that time, the country of the future. It's one of the richest countries in the world. And I suppose the tendency in East Asia often is to look at Latin America in general and Argentina in particular with sometimes in a patronizing manner. And we have had very high growth for decades. Sometimes it may sometimes be hurt to know that it could happen to us too. I mean, one of the great examples is Japan, which was the next superpower, when it was, a lot of literature was written about in the 1980s, and then went into decline. From one lost decade, it became two lost decades, and Japan is still trying to find its way to get back into the elixir of growth. So I think listening to Dr. Reengagement when he talks about Argentina, I think he's going to talk about what is to be done. Way forward, he has a view. I think it will be quite interesting to hear what he has to say. So may I call on you, Dr. Reengagement, to take us through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tech, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure that we can share some moments with all of you and take upon your questions or your doubts or your queries about the region, and in particular about Argentina. But again, I have prepared a written speech which will be on your website, speaking more specifically about the challenges, the topic of my speech, but I really would like not to repeat myself. It's a well-developed paper. Let me point out first how I feel after being 4 days in Singapore. This is my third time being here, and especially coming back to school. You know, this sort of outfit reminds me of my time when I was a student, and the same sort of layout you have at Harvard in terms of you know, this kind of auditorium. And maybe remind me when I was walking down the corridors of this very prestigious university about my timing as a student, and in particular when I had to go out of school in looking for a job. People always speak very highly about Harvard as a very, very prestigious education university, but sometimes we tend to think of Harvard as a very good placement agency. And in particular, you know, you have there interviews where after you end up your 2 years in a master's degree, you have companies coming into campus to interview you. And I recall that after being in one session, they called me to New York. It was an investment bank back in the mid-'80s. That tells you how old I am. And I remember going through, at that time, we started interviews from 8:30 in the morning up until 5 in the afternoon. And every half an hour, you go over, they put you through in different experiences. What will you do to finance XYZ corporation? At that point, we had several currencies in Europe. So after going through this process, exhausting process during the whole day, I met the vice chairman of the corporation, and he said, Martin, we have put you through all sorts of challenges in terms of the world of finance, how corporations will do. Now, let me put you through this situation. Let's say you had a very good year with us, and you get a very good bonus, and because of that, you decide to buy a 2-seat Ferrari, okay? And you start driving it through the streets of New York, and it starts raining, like it did half an hour ago here in Singapore. It starts pouring rain, and you pass by a bus stop, and you see a terrific blonde, a very old and weak grandmother, and your boss. Who do you put in that empty seat? He said to me. And many times, and I feel like this at this point, you're on the spot. Now, what do you say? How can you find something different to say? No, always trying to, you know, I guess the differentiation strategy always works. No, and I don't know basically about physics or anatomy, how, you know, what happens in your brain in terms of how do you get new ideas. So, but you know, I started thinking fast, no? And the first thing I thought was, obviously, you know, we Latins have two sort of hearts, not trying to keep an eye on the weak, and therefore, obviously, you think about the grandma. We are also quite selfish, so clearly I thought about the blonde, no? I'm trying to keep the blonde for myself. But, you know, obviously in the ambience of Wall Street, I would be discarded if I took the grandma to be too weak, if I took the blonde to be too selfish. So I don't know what came into my mind, and I said, well, I guess I will do the following. I will give the key of the car to my boss so he can take the grandma, and I will go walking along the street with the blonde down the rain. I got my first job at Salomon Brothers this way. So this is the way how I feel in terms of trying to speak about Latin America at this juncture, trying to find what are the originalities that Latin America has, and in particular about Argentina. Let me first say that the title of my conversation with you this afternoon is basically the complementarities between Asia and Latin America. One of the key things, as I said, this is the third time that I come to Singapore, that I'm always surprised by the projects, by the strategy, by how you plan your cities, by how you plan the well-being of your population. When I came last time for the 2006, exactly, October 2006, the IMF World Bank meeting, you didn't have the gardens on the bay. You didn't have that phenomenal building that you have with a 150-meter pool down there. You didn't have many things that you have. So the investment that you do in infrastructure is one of the things that comes out as something that you do everything man-made. We have that in terms of natural resources. We have gardens, we have extensions of land, and clearly that's where I see the first issue that I want to touch upon is the complementarities that I see moving forward between your region and my region. Let me say that also there is a set of policies that it is there in the region that it is there as a permanent basis, and it is not here to change. The region has been known for the variety of the financial crisis that we had in the last 30 years. So always when you have turmoil in the international financial markets, you say how this is going to affect Latin America. And probably because of the mistakes that we have made in the past, there are certain things that are permanent. And there is a macro policy framework that, in my opinion, is here to stay. This macro approach or this macro policy has four main pillars. The first is fiscal solvency. What was before a question of discussion in Latin America about fiscal discipline is not a matter more of left and right. It's a matter of common sense. And you have that this discussion in Brazil, in Mexico, in Peru, in Colombia, in Chile, in almost all of the countries in Latin America. You have fiscal discipline, and you see this, for example, in the ratio of debt to GDP. When you look at the region, most of the countries in our region have a debt to, even Argentina, that I'm going to speak in a little while, has a debt to GDP which is less than 40%. Okay, so much less than what you have in all the countries around the world. So the capacity to do countercyclical policies is very much down there. The second issue that is quite permanent is that most of the countries look for anti-inflationary policies. We have a very low inflationary environment in Latin America, with the exception of a couple of countries. One is mine, in particular, after the government decided to take over the central bank in 2010, and that's when I said to the president, thanks, but no thanks. The third area, or the third pillar that you have there, is a much stronger trade openness, or much more diversified trade with the different areas of the world. And much more, Latin America was before very much focused in terms of trade vis-a-vis the US and vis-a-vis Europe, and now you have countries in Latin America looking for trade agreements all over the world, and in particular with the Asian countries, and in particular with this part of the world. And Singapore has good initiatives with many countries in Latin America that, in my view, are going to come to fruition as we start to seek more linkages between your part of the world and my part of the world. The last area where there is permanent policies is the liquidity buffers that Argentina and the rest of Latin America have built. When you look since the last, and in the introduction it was mentioned that after the Lehman Brothers crisis, not only Argentina, I weathered the storm being the central bank governor, but I will say all of the governors from Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego, from Mexico down to the tip of South America, what you find is that not one single bank has failed in the region. This is not because we are cleverer than our colleagues in Europe or in other parts of the world, but basically because we've learned our lessons. So what you see in all of the countries is that there are liquidity buffers being established there that can allow you basically to move and to have more room to maneuver. Basically also, knowing that you are in public policy, I see that one of the problems that we have in emerging economies is the mismatch that you have when you look at the balance sheets of our countries between assets and liabilities. The mismatch in currencies, We see that this time around in Europe. For example, take the case of Hungary. In Hungary, what you have is that people were giving loans in Swiss francs, and they had their salaries in local currency. So when there was a depreciation in the local currency, people could not pay the mortgage. Okay? So that's what we call a mismatch in asset and liability that comes all over and over in terms of world financial crisis. I hope that this lesson is learned for Africa, that when we have 10 years or 15 years, at some point, we will have another financial crisis, that we don't have in any part of the world a mismatch in terms of assets and liabilities. And we don't have, when you look at assets and liabilities from Mexico down to Argentina, you have assets in local currency and liabilities in local currency. So therefore, the balance sheet of our countries, the liquidity buffers are there. Take the case of Brazil, for example. Brazil has built reserves in the central bank that are 16% of GDP. Okay, so when we look at Brazil, which has really been sort of the star performer of the region, not so in the last years. Why not so? Because they haven't done, in particular from the fiscal point of view, countercyclical policies. There are some countries that have saved in the good times to spend in the bad times. In particular, Chile is the best example of that. By depending only on copper prices, what they have done is basically set up an equation by which when prices of copper are below, are on top of a benchmark, they save, and when the prices of copper are below that benchmark, they spend, either in lower taxes or by increasing public sector expenditure. So those are the policies that basically are here to stay. What is lagging in Latin America is a competitiveness agenda. Is how to make our economies more innovative, how to make business practices more easy, how to make basically increasing capital expenditure, how we increase, in a nutshell, competitiveness for the rest of our economies. Some countries are much more at the forefront in terms of their agenda, and this is the case of Mexico. Mexico in particular, in my view, what they've had is an agreement between the three main political parties on policies that are here to stay. And they have set up policies in terms of deregulating the labor market, making unions to be more flexible in terms of their performance, tying in particular a reform on education that has been critical in that country, to tie performance to their salaries. And by putting in jail the head of the labor union, of the teachers' labor union, gave a strong message that the president was really going to deliver. Second, a reform in the oil sector, basically opening up the oil sector to the private sector. Pemex, the national oil company, was like a sacred cow. For 70 years, the PRI, who was the leading party there, didn't allow private investment, in particular in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the change was there, but the most important thing about the change is that the three main political parties agree on this, that this was a policy that was here to stay. Third, having a fiscal anchor, agreeing that a fiscal surplus is critical to any government, regardless what kind of government you have. And fourth, opening up and leading with a key businessman, one of the richest person in the world, Carlos Slim, who is the owner of Telmex, and opening up the monopoly on telecommunications. These four elements were critical to make now Mexico at the forefront of the competitiveness agenda, which unfortunately is something that Brazil hasn't come upon yet. Brazil probably, and that is a problem of countries that are endowed with great natural resources. We become very complacent. Argentina, like Brazil, we are commodity producers, And therefore, in particular, there is a very good wave towards the prices of commodity products, in particular soft commodities. Let me say a word about that in a moment. But in the case of Brazil, really you have discounted a lot of good things happening in the future. And unfortunately, the investment in infrastructure, which is something where Singapore has a lot to offer, the investment in infrastructure has not been there. So what you need is the potential capacity for growth in Brazil because of the lack of investment in physical capacity and in human capacity. You're looking for new ventures. It's very tough to get highly qualified individuals in Brazil, in management, in engineering, and in different positions. So therefore, the lack of investment in infrastructure, in physical and in human infrastructure, puts a lid in terms of the capacity that Brazil has to grow in the near future. So my scenario there is that there is no crisis out in Brazil, there's no crisis out in other countries in Latin America because this macro framework is here to stay. Some countries are going to excel because of having a stronger competitiveness agenda. Some countries are going to lay low in terms of the possibilities of growth unless they invest in people, they invest in physical infrastructure, and that's the agenda that you need to follow in the case of Brazil. Let me say a brief word about commodities and then go into Argentina in the rest of my conversation with you. Commodities, usually, we tie the concept of the price of commodities to the behavior in China. That is why many countries in Latin America, we are much more China sensitive than US sensitive. I mean by US sensitive, the sensitivity towards the rise in interest rate or the easy money policy that you've had so far in the developed economies. That's a case mainly of Brazil and Argentina, where clearly what goes on in China becomes a critical element in terms of our economic policy. Now, let me say that when you look at commodities, sometimes we need to, and this is a problem also when you look at regions, analysts tend to put things in a bulk. You speak about commodities in general. Commodities are very different. It's very different iron ore than soybean. Okay, it's very different soft commodities than hard commodities or industrial commodities. It is clear that when we look at the balance of risks in this world, we look first about China. Are we going to have a soft landing or a hard landing? Clearly, this audience have much more experience with China than I do, and clearly we can speak about that. In my view, we are more into the soft landing patch in terms of what could happen in the economic scenario in China. Soft landing will hurt more industrial commodities than soft commodities. Why do I say this? Because soft commodities don't depend only on China. There is a structural change in the world, and the need for food is not happening not only from China, but one of the structural mega trends that you have in the world is basically the rise of middle classes in emerging markets. And this happens in the Middle East, this happens in Asia, this happens in Africa, this happens in Latin America. What is the single most important feature that you have in rising middle classes? When people leave the poverty line and they come into having better incomes, they change their diet. That's the first thing that they do. They increase the amount of proteins that they have in their diet. That clearly is one signal for demand of food products. The second mega trend that you have in the world is the tension that we have in terms of creating new sources of energy, non-conventional energy, and the use of food, or the use, for example, of sugar, the use of corn in order to produce biofuels. The need to diversify from fossil fuels to different kind of fuels, and therefore the trend there to use food as an energy producer. That's another source of demand that you have for commodities, for soft commodities. And also the fact that when you started to feed animals, because of the type of diet that we want to have, leaner diets, what we need to have also is we have more, for example, soya is now being used to feed pork in order to have leaner meat, in order to have better quality. There's another source of demand that you have at this point. So for example, the case of Argentina, that is highly dependent on soybean and soybean oil, although we have lower growth in this last 3 to 4 months, the price of soybean is increasingly going up. Of course, we don't have in front of us the fantastic ride that we had in the last years, but I see a source of resilience in this product, and that's good and bad news, because countries like Brazil, countries like Argentina, when we are blessed with this type of prices, we become more complacent, and so the agenda for reform is not there as it is in other countries that need to thrive for new sources of food or for better yields or better productivity in this area, because you have more needs, more social needs from your population. The other area where I see strong complementarities is in the area of energy. Singapore in particular, but also the rest of Asia, has a need for energy resources where Latin America has a surplus. And in particular, the resources of shale gas and shale oil, not only in Mexico, but also in Argentina, and this is less known, in the province of Mendoza, nearby the boundary of Chile, you have one of the largest reservoirs of oil and gas, of shale oil and gas, that you have in the world. So even with this instability that Argentina has at this point, companies like Chevron have crafted deals in order to invest $1.5 billion in the rest year and a half. So another area where if we have the right policies there is a strong room to grow and a strong room to find. So when we look at infrastructure and when we look at complementarities, in my view, that's the agenda to work primarily with focus between Latin America, between Singapore, Latin America, and the rest of the Asian countries. Let me turn the page now to Argentina, and why I think, and I have to thank the Foreign Ministry, Ambassador CK, who made it possible, my visit and my spending a week in speaking to your top officials, your sovereign wealth funds, because I think there is a time of change in Argentina at this point. Why do I say there is a time of change? We have an election should be normal, in 2015, but we have an election that is not one more election. After having almost 11 years of Kirchnerism, first Mr. Kirchner and then Mrs. Kirchner in government, this government is coming to an end. One of the key things that has happened, and many people spoke about the permanence of the Kirchner for decades. One thing that is not happening is that there is no reform of the Constitution. So Mrs. Kirchner cannot run again, okay? In terms of what we know is that there is going to be change, that there is going to be new players in Argentinian politics in 2015. Why is this election so important? This is the first time that the sons of democracy will be leading in terms of representing the key political parties. Why do I say the sons of democracy? Because as you were mentioning in terms of the Economist and the 100 years of decline, Argentina has always had a fragmented society. Peronism and not Peronism, military against dictatorship, against democracy, always adversarial relations. The sons of democracy, people that have voted, that when they were 18 years old, they voted, okay? These are the people that are going to conduct Argentina in the near after 2015. So they don't have the scars of the past. They don't have the antagonism of the past. They don't have the wounds of people that have even fought internal civil wars as we had in the last 30 years. So hate is not in their soul. Hate is not in their hearts. The idea of trying to build consensus, thinking that the person that is not in agreement with myself is not an enemy, but somebody that I could gain from their ideas, is something that it is a new theme in Argentina. And if you see that Mrs. Kirchner lost the parliamentary election in the province of Buenos Aires to a group of mayors that is led by Mr. Massa, a group of mayors that is between 40 and 50 years old, that are much closer to the problems of the population. So what you have is a cadre of governors, a cadre of mayors that are going to compete in the elections that are much closer to the needs of the population, that are much more practical, that are much more problem solvers. So this generation has a major challenge. The major challenge is basically to build consensus among a number of policies that are there to stay. We have mentioned very briefly the opportunities that Argentina has in shale gas and shale oil. I have the possibility of talking to all political parties. Probably there are going to be 3 competing in the next election, which have the possibility of winning. They all agree that we need a common energy policy. And a common energy policy means that we will give stability to foreign players, stability in terms of tax stability, not creating any new taxes, stability in terms of dividend flows, stability of using the foreign exchange the way they want if they are investing in long-term projects. Having tax amortization that is much accelerated than in other industries. So there is consensus that a strong energy policy needs to be put in place. There is also a consensus that inflation needs to come down. Argentina at this point has 35% inflation, and today we are having a general strike. Why? Because people feel that the salaries are not enough to abate, to really catch upon with the increase that you have in prices. So the agenda there is to have common policies in terms of energy, common policies in terms of having a fiscal anchor that will allow inflation to come down gradually, a common policy of integrating to the rest of the world. I had, a couple of weeks ago, I went with one of the presidential candidates to the US. Other presidential candidates have been traveling abroad. This is the first time, while a year and a half away from the election, you have the key presidential candidates trying to re-engage Argentina with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, Argentina was isolated from the rest of the world, but also, let me point out that the need that this government has to arrive to the end of this cycle by the end of 2015 is forcing to do many things that they were not supposed to do. And one of the things that has happened is that, unfortunately, they use up all the dollars that I left at the central bank. I left the central bank with $52 billion in January of 2010. Now they have $26 billion and coming down. So when there is a need, you need to change. Because if you don't have enough dollars, if you have the central bank that you're using, you can print all the local currency that you want. Argentina cannot print dollars. Any country cannot print dollars. So therefore, the need of dollars is making that the government is taking some steps in order to get integrated to the rest of the world economy. There are some issues that have happened in the last months that have been encouraging out of a need. People that follow the Argentinian situation knew or know that we didn't have transparent statistics. The news is that since a month ago, we have inflation being well measured with statistics that are more in line with private sector estimates. Second, something that was terribly implemented, that was the nationalization of the oil company Repsol from the Spanish. Well, finally, the government decided to settle after, and this was not out of really being decided, but they knew that if they needed more investment, they need to settle the nationalization of Repsol. Third, finally, Argentina is settling down with the Paris Club. The Paris Club, as you know, is a club of European nations that have lent money to Argentina. The Paris Club has called upon the Minister of Economy of Argentina to be in Paris on May 26 to negotiate a final deal on closing that part of our story. And obviously, when you close that, you will have reopening the credit lines of many European insurance companies and credit lines that will foster basically the capacity of European companies to invest in our country. Also, the problem that we still have with holdouts, the people that have not entered into the debt restructuring, there are some private conversations that are being going on there in order to solve this issue. Is the government doing this because they want to? No, it's because of a need, the need for dollars. But the need for dollars is meaning that gradually Argentina is getting back to integrate with the world economy. Tonight, the Minister of Economy is flying to the IMF to try to start negotiating having an Article 4. For people that don't follow finances, an Article 4 is basically what every country does every year, having the IMF do an auditing of your numbers and publishing a report of your numbers, how they are and how sustainable they are. So what you have at this point is not just promises. These are concrete steps that Argentina, out of a need, is moving into integrating with the rest of the world economy. Of course, I come here to say, and people know that I have a career behind me, a credibility that I don't want to spend now. So I come back to you and tell you something that it was also coming back to my student years. I recall at that time, major theme that was going in the US was the presidency of Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev and trying to bring down the missiles that were haunting the world. And when they were signing a treaty to bring down the missiles, Mr. Reagan told Gorbachev an old saying in Russian. He says, "Doberaj noch proveraj," and that means in Russian, trust but verify. So I say the same to you when you look to Argentina. Trust that there is a new beginning, but verify that these steps are going to be along the way. Verify that the new candidates are really much in tune. I think, and I know, that we have a window of opportunity when the new administration comes in. Really, you have to look that these policies are in place, but if they are in place, clearly there is value to gain. Somebody was telling me what are the good deals to do in Argentina. Look at the valuations of Argentinian companies, people that are more in finance, vis-a-vis companies in the rest of Latin America. And I'm not speaking about take any bank in Argentina or any company in the oil and gas energy and compare it not with a Brazilian company, with a Peruvian company, okay? And you'll see the valuations in terms of book value that are half of what a Peruvian company is. So what I say out there is that if Argentina follows the right policy, if the sons of democracy that really are looking forward into integrating Argentina into the world economy, there is value to see and there is value to really take the lead on and look forward to a relationship where, in my view, the growth, the innovation, the capacity to complement comes from Asia and Latin America. It will be in each one of you to take advantage of this opportunity to make our countries a better place for our population. Thank you very much, and I leave it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll open up the floor to questions. Yeah, okay.
Good evening, sir. That was very interesting. I came here because I really do not know very much about Argentina, and I think now I'm a little bit more educated. My name is Lin Wee. Could you kindly answer two very short questions? The first one is, how do you view the state of bilateral relations between Singapore and Argentina? And secondly, what does it take to build meaningful, or rather more meaningful relations between our two countries for mutual benefit? Thank you.
Well, I must say that I have a biased opinion here. I try to give objective opinion, but I think you have the most terrific ambassador that you can have, and this in compare with the rest. I really say from the bottom of my heart, and clearly, you know, you have this idea of your foreign ministry having non-resident ambassadors and tapping people from the business community, successful businessmen, is also a very, very interesting concept, because what we see is a very focused agenda. Try to go to the essence of the problems and not to go with the marginal things about it. So I have to say that in terms of the knowledge that you have in terms of your representative is second to none if I compare to the knowledge of other ambassadors in Argentina. He doesn't only have the knowledge of the business community, but he knows the main political leaders, the ones that are here and the ones to come. And he's also very active in knowing, for example, something that many of his colleagues don't know, that are the governors of the provinces. Because usually, especially coming from a country like Singapore, which is a city and a state and a country, you tend to see things probably from a centrally point of view. So you have to deal only with the federal level. So in the case of Brazil, in the case of the United States, you need to deal with the provinces, with the governors, with the companies there, and that's where the action is. So I think that you're doing as best as you can with the constraints that Argentina has, that unfortunately in the last years we have been much more a failure on us. We have been much more an inward looking. Unfortunately, Argentina has good relations or talks to only two countries, Venezuela and Iran. That's not a foreign policy. Not even with our neighbor, Brazil, we have a more substantive agenda. So clearly, I think you're very well positioned. What I will suggest is that we need to have more people from the private sector involved on both countries. Clearly, in terms of tapping business opportunities, I think that at least the 10 top business groups in Argentina that go from soybean oil to steel tubes, seamless steel tubes, and which is a company that is leading in the world on that, unfortunately is based also in Singapore. But the more you could get, because the private sectors are the permanent sectors in both countries. So the more you could do at the level of the foreign ministry, the more you could do also in terms of scholarships and in terms, here we are in the most distinguished school of public policy probably among many countries in Asia. I would like to have more students from this school coming to Argentina and vice versa. And so getting to know people, that also for countries to get along together, it's also good is personal relationships also what matter at the end of the day. Credibility, long-term relationship, establishing basically people that you could trust. So, and again, if I would have to leave a word of advice, I would say there are opportunities in particular in infrastructure and in energy. So focus on those and others, but I would like more to have the top 10 business group in Argentina get together in a room for a day in a seminar, either in Singapore or in Buenos Aires, and think about the next decade in both of our countries or what we could do together. That is something that I leave you as a food for thought for your group, for this university, for your government.
Thank you. Any? Yeah, Donald.
Thank you very much, Dr. Redrado. My name is Donald. I'm a faculty member at the school. Could you say something about industrial development in Argentina? I know you touched on agriculture and commodities, but really for a country of Argentina's size, you probably need a manufacturing sector. And on that score, the international economic institutions haven't been particularly helpful. I think the advice they gave on privatization and on government stepping out of industrial policy probably didn't contribute very much to Argentina's industrial development. Do you think the game is over as far as manufacturing is concerned, or do you think there's a way for Argentina to regain competitiveness in manufacturing?
I would say that, of course, unfortunately, we have to summarize, and in terms of putting where are the competitive advantages of Argentina, and we mentioned commodities, but I will say agribusiness. There is really moving along the value-added chain in agricultural products. So that's why I mentioned food rather than, thank you for your question, because I have spoken a lot about commodities and not so much about food. But when you look at food processing, that's an area where you have value added, where you have also innovation, where you have product differentiation. You may not know that the number one candy producer in the world comes from Argentina, a company called Arcor in Cordoba. That is something that I would like Arcor to be established also in Singapore, but you find it in China, but as trading, they have a trading house in Barcelona in Europe, where they serve this area of the world. It's too far to serve Asia. So there are many, I would say, agribusiness in terms of the quality of canned products, for example, that is second to none. That there is a strong room to maneuver. We were speaking before about wines. Red wines, Argentina has come a long way. But also, in terms of manufacturing, I will say the automotive sector has done a tremendous growth in the last year. We have particularly the integration between Brazil and Argentina, Brazil producing more massive cars, Argentina producing more top-tier cars. The amount of integration that you have there, you have a market of around 1 million cars only in Argentina. So when you look at Mercosur, we're speaking about almost 4 million cars. So any company, from the Volkswagen to the Nissan of this world, need to be in Mercosur, either in Brazil or in Argentina. There are other areas in services that are of particular interest. Actually, I have left to you 3 presentations. One is more a speech that I hope it is put in the website. But if you are interested, there are 2 other areas 2 PowerPoints that I have been using here in Singapore. One is in looking at more values from the point of view of spreads vis-a-vis of where there is gains in particular. The other is more strategic in terms of what are the sectors that Argentina is a winner. And there I mentioned, for example, telecommunications. Not in particular manufacturing cell phones, but actually in the software that goes inside here. We have more cell phones in Argentina than people. We have 52 million cellular phones and 40 million people. So the amount of products that you could put through cellular phone, from banking to you name it, text messages and so forth. What you have there is related to this, the quality of engineers in Argentina vis-a-vis the price is very, very competitive when you look to the rest of Latin America. So the generation of Spanish-speaking software for Iberoamerica, I would say even to include Spain and the US, as you know, where Spanish is a second language, has very, very strong competition capacities. Biotechnology, in particular, that's an area where, Argentinians, we are very creative people. We improvise a lot, as you've seen in my talk, where I've been very disorganized. But improvisation leads to creativity. So we have, in biotechnology, in particular applied to agriculture, in terms of fertilizers, genetic engineering, for example. We are at the forefront of technology in terms of animal clonation, which is probably unheard of. The capacity we have in terms of building second generation GMOs, genetically modified organisms. It is something where Argentina, where you have the researchers, the universities, faculties like yourself, and the producers working together in very competitive clusters. So therefore, there in biotechnology, Argentina is second to none, second to the US, not second to the US, very much competitive, or even to Australia. The yields that we get in our farm capacities is really, and the capacity to export there is really phenomenal. Biofuels is another area where you have, again, industrial applications out of natural resources. Last but not least, something that we haven't exploited with Africa, with Asia and Africa and the rest of the world, unfortunately, too focused with the US and in Europe, and your ambassador has tried to do a lot of work there, is tourism. Clearly, there is not enough because of lack of connectivity. And that's more the blame on our side than the blame on your side. But when we look at the natural beauties that Argentina has, in terms of, for example, when you think about skiing, where do you ski in June or July? Where you ski in Argentina or in Chile? Okay, so thinking about that, or the resources that we have in Patagonia, the natural things that you have there, the waterfalls in the Northeast. So the variety, this is a country, Antarctica. So the amount of tourism projects that you have there, and fortunately, knock on wood, we don't have terrorist attacks, so tourists feel safe when they travel over there. So again, those are other areas in services, telecommunications, and industry where Argentina is already being developed, has already key sources, but obviously, if you have a better environment for invest, those are areas where you could thrill upon. Last but not least, mining. Mining in particular, copper and copper production and gold production. That's an area where it's being very well exploited in Chile. We have a few projects in Argentina going on, but we could have much more.
There was a question.
Thank you for this. I have one question. What can you tell us about Brazil and its relation with Argentina?
Brazil, as I said, is a source of stability for the region in terms that it has a very solid macro framework in place, and there is no way back. Yes, the current president has tackled very difficult issues, like, for example, corruption, and I think she has been at the forefront of that, and everybody should commend her to be on that. Unfortunately, she hasn't been at the forefront of competitiveness reform, of tax reforms, of cutting the red tape that you do to do business in Brazil as you have in other countries. So my view of Brazil is that, again, they are a leading force in terms of knowing and understanding that Latin America is a source of stability, that there is no way back to the previous policies that we had in the past. The key challenge is, as I said, how do you bring upon reforms? In my view, the key policy agenda that they have is not so much building football stadiums for the next World Cup, but building roads, building bridges, building ports, building airports, so that their logistic costs are lower than what you have at this point. The logistic costs in Brazil are around 30 to 40% higher than you have in the developed world. So clearly, how to cut costs in different areas where you could be made more competitive and bring innovation upon. In terms of the relation with Argentina, clearly we have to say that it's more to blame on our side than on their side. Argentina, because again, of a bad decision that was to tap the central bank in order to deplete the institution of its own resources, Argentina has run out of foreign exchange reserves or of the enough dollars that you need in order to pay debts, in order to pay for the imports, and we started to have a lot of restriction on imports. And so that has hurt the relation with our neighbors, where we have a more interactive trade. Brazil is the main trade partner of Argentina, and we start lacking the dollars, we start imposing restrictions. And that has generated tensions in a relation that shouldn't have tensions, and that we should be thinking much more on what to do in terms of the next generations. Obviously, in terms of infrastructure, there is, I would say, not only with Brazil, but a lagging agenda in terms of integrating all of South America. No? And I was speaking to here my Asian colleagues. You probably have the same challenge in the Asian countries, in the Southeast Asian countries. What are the critical areas in infrastructure where you need to build upon in the next years? That is the same challenge that we have in terms of Brazil, Argentina, and the rest of South America. But fortunately, Brazil is a country that has long-term objectives. It's one of the countries that I really admire. Their leading class in terms of their business communities, politicians. If you ask a Brazilian, a union leader, a business leader, a politician, where will Brazil be in 2025, they will give you a common vision, okay? And that has to be probably with the Brazilian inheritance. As you know, Brazil was an empire. They came to be, they had 2 emperors in the 19th century coming from Portuguese heritage. So they see themselves as, one of the leading minds in Brazil, who was foreign ministry at the beginning of the 20th century, the Barón de Rio Branco. He spoke about Brazil as a continent, okay? Is the idea of a continent itself. So clearly what you have there is a shared vision of where Brazil should be. And President Lula has coined a good phrase about Argentina. He said in private, we need to have strategic patience with Argentina because it is our partner. It is there. So fortunately, we have from the leading political class strategic patience. And we hope that as Argentina becomes more normal, we have a more intense relation in order to basically build a better agenda for our two countries.
One final question? Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Pranav, and just wanted a clarification from you. You said that Latin American countries have been saving in the good times for the bad times. Just wanted to clarify, do you feel that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I feel that's a good thing. I feel that, I wouldn't say all of Latin America, but clearly in a world, I would say, if you ask me from, as you know, I'm an economist by training, so I tend to simplify in economic terms the world problems, which is a mistake. But if you tell me what is the biggest challenge that any policymaker in an emerging country, be in Asia, be in Indonesia, be in Thailand, being in South Africa, being in Brazil, has in front of it, is how to manage capital flows, in particular capital inflows and capital outflows. As we have a world where we had easy money policy, we had a lot of money easily coming into our countries, and clearly that has appreciated a lot of our currencies. So in my view, some countries have smoothened the way to appreciation by not letting the currency appreciate, but having the central bank buying reserves, building foreign exchange reserves, so they have saved in the good times. So when there are capital outflows, and now what you see is that gradually interest rates are going up, and what you see also, you have seen that in July of last year, when Mr. Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the former chairman, the chairman at that point, he said that gradually he was going to take the stimulus out of quantitative easing 3, then interest rate jack up in terms of the 10-year bond, and most of emerging market currencies depreciated because we didn't use, countries that had reserves didn't act fast, or countries that didn't have reserves couldn't act as a countercyclical policy in order to smoothen the trend towards a devaluation. So what you could do is, from a monetary point of view or from a fiscal point of view, if you save in the good times, when you have a recession, what you have is you can lower taxes. So you have more private sector consumption, more private sector investment. Or if you are more interventionist, you increase public sector expenditure in infrastructure, in housing, you name it. So you sort of smoothen the trend. What a policymaker should do, if I can leave a piece of recommendation in this very distinguished audience, is to build counter-cyclical policies. I mean, to try to smoothen the trends in terms of economic growth, or to have, it is much better to have 30 years of growth at 4% than 2 years of growth at 8 and then a bust at 0.
Okay, with that, I think we come to an end on counter-cyclical policies. I think sometimes you have belief in the treatment where he thinks there are lags, including political lags, it may end up being pro-cyclical.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Okay, with that, shall we show appreciation for Dr. Ridiado?
Thank you.